Greetings to the lovely audience, and welcome to this podcast series on the Indo Pacific, brought to you by Asian Conference. Our first episode for the series, as the title suggests, is going to be about the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. The Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, proposed jointly by Australia, India, and Japan on September 1st, 2020, provides an indicator of the anticipated alterations in the post COVID 19 global economic system. The project is dedicated to reshaping the structure of cross border production networks in the Indo Pacific in the backdrop of the COVID 19 pandemic. Today, we shall be discussing different aspects of this initiative in order to understand its impact on the Indo Pacific more deeply. But before we go into more detailed discussions, let me introduce to everyone our guest speaker for today, Ms. Natasha Jha Bhaskar. Natasha is General Manager of Newland Global Group, a Sydney based leading Australian corporate advisory firm specializing in Australia India trade and investment space. With 12 years of previous work experience at the Indian Parliament in policy analysis, advocacy, and communication. Natasha has also been a delegate to national and international parliament conferences like SARC, ASEAN, and BRICS. We are very glad to have such an eminent person as our first guest. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks for the opportunity, Anushka. Pleasure speaking with you.
So let's get straight into it, Natasha. Since we have such a prominent expert on India Australia trade relations, let me ask you, what can you tell us about India Australia maritime relations in the Indo Pacific and the consequent supply chain initiative with Japan?
Thanks very much, Anushka, for the warm introduction and for this opportunity to share thoughts on an issue that's most pertinent today. The pace of disruption that we have witnessed over the last 2 years has been greater than the last 20. Coming to the first part of your question on India Australia relations in the Indo Pacific, Anushka, what we are witnessing today is a very dynamic global strategic and economic landscape that is redefining power, principles, and values on which the regional order should be based. The emergence of the Indo Pacific region as a strategic construct with its economic ambitions is the desire to build an inclusive and economically integrated region with like minded countries that thrives on openness, connectivity, and equitable rules, I would say. So, if you see today, Australia India ties are going from strength to strength. The bilateral ties are elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And a key component of the upgrade is also our mutual commitment towards maritime cooperation in the Indo Pacific. A shared vision, a declaration that sets the stage for deeper maritime security cooperation between the two sides. Security collaboration at the bilateral and multilateral level is already underway. As we know, there's been the OS Index naval exercise, Indian Navy's flagship Milan exercise, and Australia's return to the Malabar exercise. Now, both sides have also signed a few agreements and MOUs in specific areas of cooperation, such as cyber threats and science and technology, the Mutual Logistics Support Agreement, which enables maritime security specifics such as port visits and use of bases, as well as cooperation in areas such as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. As the two largest maritime powers among Indian Ocean littoral states, India and Australia have a large role to play. As we talk, Anushka, Australia's Trade Minister Dan Tehan is visiting India to lend further momentum to the Australia-India Free Trade Deal, also known as the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. And it's promised, in fact, today in the announcement, Minister Tehan mentioned that an interim agreement, an early harvest agreement is promised by December 2021, and a full-fledged completed FTA, which is also known as a Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, is promised by end of 2022. So what we are witnessing is deepening and strengthening of Australia-India ties at strategic level at maritime level as well as at economic level. And having said that, countries are also aware that economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic will also depend on the ability to boost trade and investment. So the twin impacts of geopolitical tensions and COVID-19 have caused significant disruption to supply chains, over reliance on China for supply of critical products, including essential food and medical items, which has in fact exposed the weakness of the trading economy, I would say. So, the supply chain resilience initiative between Australia, India, and Japan is a response to this crisis. What it tells us is that the apparent barriers of the pandemic has in fact, in reality, created a new kind of catalyst for greater connectivity, cooperation, and coexistence. The Indo-Pacific is emerging as this new pivot to power. And SCRI reflects this emerging structural shift in geostrategic and geoeconomic imagination and environment. Under the SCRI, the countries will share best practices on supply chain resilience and will hold investment promotion and buyer-seller matching events to address trade and investment barriers and provide opportunities for stakeholders to diversify their supply chains. What we also must note here that all these three countries, Australia, India, and Japan, were the early adopters of the Indo-Pacific. All the three governments had formally incorporated the term into their foreign policy lexicon by 2013. And today, SCRI is possibly the strongest example of a mini-lateral coalition in the Indo-Pacific between all these three countries, I would say.
So, my second question for you would be around the China factor in determining the Indo Pacific maritime relations. As COVID 19 advanced, India, Australia, Japan, and US's ties with China have deteriorated. In the light of these developments, discussing the role of SCRI in eliminating Chinese dependency within supply chains is important. How can this initiative work as a countermove to diminish Chinese dominance in the supply chain systems of the Indo Pacific? And how much of a factor has this been in the formation of the initiative itself?
That's an important question. And as strategic analyst for the Indo-Pacific, China won't map the future. The Indo-Pacific is actually unified by the quest to balance, dilute, and absorb Chinese power. It is both a region and an idea, a metaphor for collective action, self-help combined with mutual help. It is a mental map which speaks of power, strategic imagination, and a worldview. So to answer your question, yes, China's aggression even amid a pandemic, has aligned the three SCRI countries in their shared goal to stand up to Beijing, reduce Chinese economic influence so as to limit its interference and coercive diplomacy tactics. China's unrelenting pressure on countries, its role in the pandemic crisis, its attempt to hijack multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, its territorial aggression on India, using coercive trade practices to target Australia has led countries to unite and address the crisis they are in. So, what's clear is that all these countries have charted their own paths to self realization, I would say, after experiencing some hard truths from China. However, to determine how far this initiative can work as a countermove to diminish Chinese dominance in the supply systems is still too early and difficult to predict. For instance, China exerts excessive control over supply of critical minerals essential to modern technology, which was also a key agenda point in the recent face-to-face leaders meeting of the Quad nations. It's also important to note that all these three SCRI countries have varied trade exposure to China. So India's trade exposure to China is low by regional standards at around 11% of two-way trade, while Japan's is twice as high and Australia's is a massive 30%. So the resilience of an alternative supply chain will depend on how each of these countries can decouple from China. Also, the degree of shared ambition among these countries vary as their outlook, interests, and approaches are different from one another, specifically on trade liberalization and membership of multilateral organizations like Australia and Japan are members of Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is CPTPP, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is APEC, RCEP, OECD. So, hence, India will have to endeavor to find common intersecting points of interest and collaboration with each country. And I see critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, infrastructure as key sectors where all SCRI partners may have shared interests and outlook. One would also need to determine the ultimate goal of SCRI in the region, whether it is of supply chain reconfiguration or ensuring supply chain efficiency, addressing the stretched balance sheets of companies across sectors, which will have the inhibition to move and relocate to new countries. So these factors will actually, I would say, determine the emergence of the Indo-Pacific region as a hub of global value chains, oriented trade and investment, and also the very success of supply chain resilience initiative.
Natasha, my final question for you today would be around the COVID-19 pandemic and the relation of the same with this initiative. So, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need to fix the flaws of several traditional supply chains. As such, it would be vital to discuss the impact of SCRI in the post COVID economic recovery in the Indo Pacific. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Anushka. That's a great question. Supply chains have come under immense strain in the last 2 years. As I said earlier, due to geopolitical tensions in the region and the impact of COVID 19. These factors have resulted in, amongst other things, rising costs, shipping delays, fluctuating inventory levels, and business disruption. The road ahead will be smooth or bumpy, will be determined by various factors. First, technology, innovation, and e commerce will be key to building resilient supply chains in a post COVID world. For post COVID economic recovery, it is essential that business and government understand the impact of the major trends affecting regional supply chains. From maritime perspective, success of SCRI and India's economic future in the Indo-Pacific region will largely be defined by its capacity to build on its blue economy potential that ranges across several sectors. Regional economic integration that depends on trade agreements to address trade barriers, and connectivity infrastructure to promote inter-regional trade, so ports and logistics in the Indian Ocean. In a post COVID 19 world, business will need to think carefully about how it balances resilience and cost effectiveness, as well as how to keep up with emerging technologies that are driving transformation. Technology is revolutionizing the supply chain management, I would say. The Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and improvements in data analytics are helping businesses increase manufacturing productivity, improve logistics, and provide tailored customer experiences. Sectors like automobiles, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, advanced manufacturing, critical minerals, healthcare, education, infrastructure, science and innovation, technology transfer could offer opportunities to SCRI for economic recovery. Connectivity and inclusivity in the region needs to be based on comprehensive policies, so robust legal and regulatory framework, interagency coordination that can attract investment in infrastructure, build financial systems, and shape digital economies, a necessary step to realize the Indo-Pacific trade potential and SCRI's success. Equally important is ensuring trade competitiveness, domestic economic reform. So SCRI is a significant example of how diplomacy should seek for balance between competition and cooperation, aspirations and achievables, regional and global. It should be navigated on the strong foundation of rules-based collaboration, several concerted measures that could deliver results. Impact of SCRI in post-COVID economic recovery is or will not be an isolated event, but a combination of several factors like first, problems and policies should be matched. Second, improved information and greater supply chain transparency. Data sharing, harmonization across government bodies could help expose supply chain vulnerabilities. especially in critical sectors. Third, there's a need to increase economic and technological interdependence among SCRI countries and to establish common and updated rules and standards for emerging technologies. Fourth, develop an approach of onshoring, nearshoring, or ally shoring of manufacturing and production capacity. Fifth, supply chains can also be strengthened by creating deep financial markets. For instance, critical minerals, which are critical for the future economy, similar to those that exist for bullion and oil. Invest in capacity building for realigning supply chains within Indo Pacific. So I would say forecasting is a tricky business. However, I would say that impact of SCRI will depend on policy and technology, collaboration between economies, and a precise awareness of drivers and barriers.
Well, this has given us a lot to think about, Natasha, and I just have to say that this has been a really insightful experience for me, and I suppose for our audiences listening to this podcast as well. Thank you so much for your time, Natasha, and for this wonderful conversation on such an important issue pertaining to the Indo Pacific. Well, today's podcast was brought to you by Asian Confluence, which is a public policy think tank based in India, focusing specifically on India or Northeast India relations with different stakeholders, specifically in the Indo Pacific. We hope to bring you further podcasts relating to India and its relation to the Indo Pacific within this series. We hope you enjoyed the current one, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.